I was sort of unhappy in some sense of some sort of psychological prejudice. I was unhappy with the idea that everything is deeply dehumanized because I kind of like humans. In the end, a couple of decades later, I realized actually the humans are kind of much more at the center of things than I had ever expected. So that was kind of an interesting realization. Another one like that I resisted for a long time is these things I call multi-way systems, which I had invented back in the early 90s, and which I had thought by the late 90s that was a possible view of how quantum mechanics might work, that there are these kind of many paths of history and that are being followed by the universe and so on. I really resisted that idea because I felt sort of egotistically that I didn't want it to be the case that there were all these different possible paths of history and the one I was experiencing was just one of those paths or something like that. That was the assumption that I had made about what the implications of this idea of multi-way systems would be. What I realized when we did the physics project in 2019 was that, in fact, that isn't the right picture, that the idea of multi-way systems and the idea that there are these many paths of history, that's the right story. But the thing to realize is we are embedded as observers in this universe that is branching all the time. And the critical point then is that we are branching as well. So from this first sort of naive idea that when you have something where you have many branches of history, that our experience must just go down one branch, that's really not the right picture. Actually, there are a couple of issues. One is that the branches can merge, and the other is that our experience can span many branches. We are extended objects. Our minds are extended objects in this branchial space, in the space of these possible branches. I didn't realize that until 2019. And that makes it, that means that my sort of ignoring multi-way systems for, close to 30 years was a piece of sort of incorrect prejudice. And I was kind of lucky enough that eventually kind of started thinking about, look, might as well try and take this seriously and see what its consequences actually are. It was something actually Jonathan Gorard was one of the people who's like, you should take these more seriously. I'm not sure he saw what the outcome would be, but that was why are you resisting this so much? It's perhaps so. That was, but so it's always an interesting thing when you have kind of this sort of you have to have a belief about how things are going to work, otherwise you don't even look there. But you have to just believe the experiments you're doing or the things you figure out. I mean, for me, if I was doing, back in the day when I was long ago when I was sort of first doing physics, I worked a bunch with Dick Feynman, who was a physicist who one of his great strengths was he was a really good human calculator, and I can't do that. I'm a good computer calculator, but not a good human calculator. I built these computer tools because I wasn't a very good human calculator. But Dick Feynman was really good at doing these calculations and getting to the right answer. And then he would go back and say he didn't think anybody would be impressed by the fact that he got to the right answer by doing this complicated calculation. He thought people would only be impressed if he could come up with this really simple kind of intuitive explanation of what was going on, which he often managed to come up with. Then he would throw away the calculation, never tell anybody about the calculation. And everybody would be like, how did you possibly figure out this kind of intuitive thing? And they'd all think, oh, it must be simple to come out with this intuitive thing. It wasn't simple. It was the result of some long calculation, which he didn't think anybody would be impressed with because he found it easy to do those things. I don't. For me, the only kind of thing where I know what I'm talking about is I do a computer experiment. It comes out in a certain way. The computer does what the computer does. There's no kind of sort of I might have made a mistake somewhere type situation. I think if I look at the kinds of things that I've tended to do in science, they sort of mix what one might think of as kind of philosophy and what one might think of as this kind of very detailed, kind of solid computational experiments and so on. That turns out to be, for me, has been sort of a powerful methodology for dealing with things. To go from, on the one side, sort of a general, almost philosophical understanding of how things might work, and then sort of the challenge is to be able to sort of think computationally fluently enough that you can go from that sort of philosophical understanding to say, okay, here's the program I should run that is a manifestation of that philosophical understanding, and then let's see what it actually does. And then I don't have to worry, am I getting it wrong? Because the program just does what the program does. And it's kind of, I find it kind of charming when my New Kind of Science book came out in 2002, people saying, but it's wrong. It's like, what does that mean?
What about it was wrong?
I don't know, but I mean, it's kind of, people assume that you could sort of have got the wrong answer by doing the wrong calculation or something.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CurtJaimungal.org, CurtJaimungal.org.
But this is the nature of computer experiments. You just, you specify the rule, you run the program does what the program does. There's no humans are involved. No possibility of error exists, so to speak. You can be wrong in the interpretation of what's happening. You can be wrong in the belief that what's happening in the computer experiment is relevant to something else. But the actual experiment itself, it just is what it is. Now, you can be confused, I will say. And the number one source of confusion is when people don't look at everything that happens in the experiment. So people say there's a certain tendency, in science, people have had this idea that, being scientific is about generating, numbers. And so one quite common type of mistake is to say, well, there's a lot of detailed stuff going on underneath, but I'm just going to plot this one curve as the result. And that means that you don't really get to see sort of the detail of what's happening. You're just seeing this one sort of summary, and sometimes that one summary can be utterly confusing. It can just lead you into kind of the thinking the wrong thing. And so for me, being able to have sort of the highest bandwidth thing that I think we have to kind of understand what's going on is our visual system, and being able to sort of visualize what's happening in as much detail as possible, I've always found very important. And often when I do projects, in fact, I just got bitten with this in the very latest project that I was doing, I always try to make sure that I front the effort to make the best possible visualizations.
Interesting.
Because if, the thing that one does that's a mistake is to do the project with kind of crummy visualizations and then say, and now I'm going to present it, and I'm going to make a really good visualization. Then you do the really good visualization, and then you're like, oh gosh, there's something I can now see that I didn't see while I was doing the project. So I just a little bit bitten with that because there was a particularly complicated kind of visualization that I didn't go to the effort to make quite early enough in the project that I'm currently doing. And so I'm just having to redo a bunch of things because I realized that I can understand them much more clearly using this sort of more sophisticated visualization technique. But that's that's kind of you have to that's just one of these things when you kind of start sort of thinking computationally about things. This idea that you can see as deep into the computation as possible is important, rather than saying all I care about here is this thing of plotting this one curve because that's what scientists have done for the last couple of hundred years. I think one of the things I realized only very recently about my own personal sort of scientific journey is back in the early 80s, I started doing a bunch of computer experiments, visualizing sort of the computations that were going on, figuring things out from that. And for me, doing that in 1981 or something like that was completely obvious. It was like, how could you ever not think about doing something like that? But the question was, why was that obvious to me? And, it turns out what I had been doing for several years previously was building my first big computer system, which was a system for doing algebraic computation, symbolic algebraic computation. And I had gotten into doing that because I was doing particle physics. In particle physics, one of the things you get to spend a lot of time doing is computing Feynman diagrams. Feynman diagrams are this way of working out, this S-matrix thing that I'd mentioned earlier, a particular way of doing that that's sort of the best way we know to do it. I have to say, as a sort of footnote to this, Dick Feynman always used to say about Feynman diagrams, they're kind of the stupidest way to do this kind of calculation. There's got to be a better way, he said. I remember one time telling him, if you work out, there's sort of a series that you generate of Feynman diagrams, and I think at the kth order in these Feynman diagrams, I'd worked out that the computational complexity of doing these Feynman diagrams went like k factorial to the fifth power. So as you go to higher orders, it takes unbelievably much more difficult to work things out. And so I was telling this to Dick Feynman. He's like, yeah, this is a stupid way to work things out. There's got to be a better way to do it. We haven't known what that better way is. I'm sort of excited right now because I finally think I understand kind of in a bigger, more foundational picture of what Feynman diagrams really are and how one can think about them in a way that does allow one to sort of go underneath that formalism and potentially work things out in a much more effective way. It's it's a spoiler for some things that I'm still working on, but essentially in Feynman diagrams, you're drawing these diagrams that sort of say an electron goes here and then it interacts with a photon, and then the photon interacts with another electron, and so on. It's a diagram of sort of interactions. And what I realized is that really those diagrams are diagrams about causality. They're diagrams that show the lines that represent here's an electron. Really, the electron is basically a carrier of a causality. There's an event that happens when an electron interacts with a photon, and that event has a causal effect on some other event, and that causal connection is represented by this electron line, so to speak, in this Feynman diagram. That way of understanding things allows one to connect sort of Feynman diagrams to a bunch of things that have come up in our physics project to do with things we call multi-way causal graphs. And there's a whole rather lovely theory that's starting to emerge about these things, but I haven't figured it all out yet. But in any case, that's a irrelevant sideshow. But back in the late 70s, I was trying to get computers to do these very ugly, nasty calculations of Feynman diagrams, because that was the only way we knew to work out the consequences of quantum field theory in those days, particularly QCD, which was a young field in those days. And I, as the teenage me, had the fun of being able to work out a bunch of calculations about QCD sort of for the first time. And now they're well-known sort of classic kinds of things, but then they were fresh and new because it was a new field. But it was one of the things that had happened was I had built a bunch of capability to do symbolic computation, algebraic computation. And one of the features of doing algebraic computation is that you don't just get a number as the answer. If the answer to your calculation, if the computer spits out 17.4, there's not a lot you can do with 17.4. There's not a lot of intuition you can get from 17.4 on its own. But when the computer spits out this big, long algebraic expression, it has a lot of structure. And one of the things that I had kind of learned to do was to get intuition from that structure. And so, for example, if you're doing integrals, let's say. I've never been good at doing integrals by hand, but I became, what I learned from doing thousands of integrals by computer was kind of things about the intuition about the structure of what happens in integrals. And that allows one to kind of to sort of jump ahead and see this complicated integral. It's going to be, I think, intuitively, roughly of this structure. And that's a big clue in actually being able to solve the thing on a computer. So the thing that I realized only very recently is that my kind of experience in doing algebraic computation had gotten me used to the idea that what a computer produces will be a thing that has structure from which you can get intuition. And so when I started thinking about sort of actual simple programs and what they do, it was sort of obvious to me, really was obvious, that I should just make some sort of visualization of what all the steps that were going on were, because I expected to get intuition from kind of the innards of the computation, so to speak. However, one of the things that I will say is that I started studying, in that case, cellular automata back in 1981, and I found out a bunch of things about cellular automata. I thought they were pretty interesting. And I had generated, back in 1981, I generated a picture of this thing called Rule 30, which is a particular cellular automaton that's been my all-time favorite. And it has the feature that has a very, very simple rule, but you started off from just this one black cell. It makes this complicated pattern. Many aspects of that pattern look, for all practical purposes, random. It's something that my intuition back in 1981 said couldn't happen. It said, if the rule was simple enough, there will be a trace of that simplicity in the behavior that's generated. And so when I generated a picture of Rule 30, I even put it in some paper I published, but I didn't really pay attention to it because my intuition was so strongly, nothing like that can happen. Then, actually, it's sort of methodologically amusing, I think June of 1984, I happened to get a high-resolution laser printer. They were a new thing. They were big, clunky objects at that time. And I thought I was going to go on some plane flight, and I thought I'll make some cool pictures for my new laser printer. So I printed out Rule 30 at high resolution and took it with me. And I'm starting to look at it, and it's like, what on earth is going on here? I finally sort of really started, actually, some other things had happened. I had also studied other aspects of cellular automata and how they related to theory of computation and so on. And that kind of primed me for really looking more seriously at this picture and realizing, oh my gosh, this is something that completely violates the intuition that I've always had, that to get something complicated, you need complicated rules in some sense, or you need a complicated initial condition. This is something new and different. And it is kind of amusing that I realized that it really, at that point, I was primed enough from the other things I'd studied, particularly about computation theory, that it only took a couple of days before I was like sort of telling people about, I was going to some conference, and actually I found recently there's a transcript of a Q&A session at that conference where I'm kind of talking as if I'd known it forever about, how Rule 30 works and so on. But actually, I'd only known it for 2 days. But an important point about that was, first of all, it's something I had kind of, quotes, discovered, but I had not understood. I had not internalized it. But to be able to internalize it required me to build up a bunch of other context from studying, a bunch of things about cellular automata, a bunch of things about computation theory. Given that priming, I was able to actually understand this point about what Rule 30 is and what it means. Now, for example, this phenomenon of computational irreducibility, I'm now at sort of 40 years and counting since I came up with that idea, and I'm still understanding what its implications are for whether it's for, AI ethics or for, proof of work for blockchains or a whole bunch of different areas. I'm only now understanding, in fact, the thing that I've understood most recently, I would say, is that I think a lot of the story of physics is a story of the interplay between computational irreducibility and our kind of limitations as observers of the world. That it's something like, for example, the simplest case is the second law of thermodynamics, where kind of the idea is you got a bunch of molecules bouncing around, and the second law says most of the time it will seem like those molecules get sort of more random in the configurations that they take on. And that's something people have wondered about since the mid-1800s. And I had wondered about it. It was one of the first things I got really interested in physics back when I was 12 years old or so, was this phenomenon of how does randomization happen in the second law? And what I finally have understood is that it happens because there's sort of computational irreducibility of the underlying dynamics of these molecules bouncing around, yet that's sort of, there's an interplay between that and the sort of computational limitations of us as observers. Because we as observers aren't capable of sort of decrypting the sort of computation that happened in this underlying in these underlying collisions, we just have to say, oh, it looks random to me, so to speak. And so this phenomenon of computational irreducibility, sort of at 40 years and counting, I'm still understanding sort of the implications of this particular idea. And I mean, another thing to say about sort of the progress of science, which I can see in my own life and I can also see from history of science, is it can take a long time. Once you've had some sort of paradigmatic idea, it can take a long time for one to understand the implications of that idea. And I know for things I've done, it's I'm fully recognize the fact that it's taken me sometimes 30 years or more to understand what it was that I actually really discovered. It's kind of like if other people don't figure it out for 50 or 100 years, that's kind of par for the course. Because it took me 30 years to figure out what the significance of this or that thing was. I mean, I see that also in technology development. In building Wolfram language, we build certain paradigmatic ideas. We have certain ideas about the structure of what can be in the language. And then it can sometimes take a decade before we really realize, given that structure, here's what you can build. You kind of have to get used to the ideas. You have to grind around the ideas for a long time before you kind of get to the next step in kind of seeing what's possible from them. I mean, I kind of see it as sort of this tower that one's building of ideas and technology in that case. And the higher you are on the tower, the further you've built up on the tower, the further you can see into the distance, so to speak, about what other things might be possible.
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high-quality podcast. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.